Thank you very much, Rob. Really appreciate the opportunity to talk to everyone today about invasive species and rare species. And I just wanted to start the title slide here with this study by the IUCN on invasive species across the globe. In the last 200 years, the number of new invasive species introductions has gone up, of course, but that more than a third of all first introductions were recorded between 1970 and 2014. And I just wanted to talk to you today about what we're seeing across New York with rare species and some of the nicer sites across New York in general. So I thought I'd start out with a photo of John Torr. He was our first state botanist, and in 1943 he published the Flora of the State of New York. This is the first and only complete flora of New York. But just to illustrate the fact that we've been cataloging the flora of New York for over 200 years. This was published in 1843, so he was using data from before that. And if you look at on the upper left, on the left side, you can see some of the invasive species that we have now that were cataloged back in 1843. Common purple loosestrife, mugwort, and common reed, which down below he said it's not common. So we don't know if that was actually the native common reed that was here, or whether these were the first introductions of the European Phragmites. But anyway, some of these plants have been here for a long time, and probably back then they were just getting started. You can see the purple loosestrife there at the bottom. It says border of Murderers Creek in Orange County, where it occurs in many places for several miles. So even back then it was fairly common in that area anyway. And on the right is a comparison of the 1986 flora done by Mitchell. This is a checklist of plants in New York State. And then the 2017 recent list by David Worrier. And you can see that there have been 94 new exotics introduced into the state since 1986, which is about 3 per year. So new exotics are coming into New York all the time. How many of these new ones are invasive? We don't know exactly. We haven't done an analysis of which ones have become invasive, except for ones that we know, like nodding bromegrass, the Brachypodium, and Asian sand sedge. But some of these are probably in their lag phase. And all, from the 1840s all the way up until now, there's been a lot of people looking at the flora of New York universities, especially the State Museum. And then in 1983, the Natural Heritage Program started and became a formal program within DEC in 1985. And these are some of the first scientists here. This is Ray, she was our computer person, and Bob Zaremba here. It was a botanist who did a lot of surveys on Long Island for the first 2 years. Carol Rushke was our community ecologist. Steve Clements was our first botanist based here in Albany, and then a zoologist and a coordinator for the program, Pat Melhop. But down below you can see one of the main responsibilities of the Heritage Program was to identify the locations and the status of rare plants, rare animals, rare and significant ecological communities across the state, and then recently with IMAP invasive species. So we have been looking at rare species and communities across the state since then for about 35 years. And not only are we looking at rare species, but every time we go out, we also look at the whole flora of that site. So for example, here's Bob Zaremba doing some work back in '85 at the Hempstead Plains. You can see the Nassau Coliseum there in the background. And every time we went out, we write up one of these site survey summaries about what we're looking for and the person and the date that we go out. And as you can see, we go out to certain sites, especially important sites, over and over. And we can understand what kinds of trends are happening with the flora in those areas. And each time we're at a site, we take a plant list. And here's one of Bob's early plant lists from, this is actually a coastal plain pond, and would denote if it was an herb, tree, or shrub, if it was a dominant, things like that. So we have a lot of good lists from around the state from our early work. No invasives on that list. And then later, starting around 2000, 2002, we started using what we call the field form database and putting that information into a database. And here you can see entries from another coastal plain pond here, third pond Calverton, of species there. And on the right there's a box to say if it's exotic or not. And then those lists can be printed out as a site report. This is one for Pilot Knob up on Lake George. And this is a list that I took back in 2006, I think that is. And you can see the list on the left, mostly native plants except for Hypericum perforatum, which is St. John's wort, the common St. John's wort. That was the only exotic plant there. And we also take these lists by community. So you can see a hemlock hardwood forest. This is the list for that. And this shows the places that the Heritage Program scientists have been from 2002 to 2017. So we're around the state all summer long doing community work. This doesn't include the zoology work, but these are places where we're taking rare plant information and also doing plant lists. You can see a lot of places that we go often, like the Hudson River and the Shawangums, the Hudson Highlands, Allegheny State Park, in the Adirondacks. We also record the threats. We have a threats field that we record the invasive species if they are a threat to the rare species. So you can see at the bottom there, the species most listed by us over time are many of the common invasive species that you see throughout the state, sort of these tier 4 species that we know about. A lot of times we only said invasive species are a problem, and we didn't put in the exact species. You would have to go to the plant list to find that out. And besides us doing all these plant lists, we also collect plant lists from around the state that people have done. And these are all, this is just 2 of the 4 bookshelves that we have of plant lists from the start of listing back in the early 1800s. So we can refer to these now. We have a lot of these digitally, so, and we're trying to scan a lot of these too. So we know what's been happening through time at a lot of the sites around the state. For example, here's a plant list from the Hempstead Plains that Bob Zaremba did separately. And here back in 1984, the beginning of this list, there was 1 invasive species here, Artemisia vulgaris, the mugwort. That's not mugwort in the picture, that's a nice goldenrod. That mugwort is threatening. So I just want to go through some of the places where we've seen things change over time, and especially since the 1980s. So first start out here on the South Fork, and over on the left is a Nature Conservancy preserve called Big Woods, and up in the upper right is another salt marsh called Northwest Creek. And when Jennifer Dean first started here in the Natural Heritage Program, 2010, we took her down here to the South Fork of Long Island to look at some places. And one of the places we went was Big Woods because there was some nice rare species there we wanted to show her. And this is the salt marsh there. And you can see there were 5 rare plants listed at the top there, which we wanted to show her. They were expanded in 1995. When we went back in 2010, they were all extirpated by Phragmites. The Phragmites had grown over the salt marsh, and we couldn't find any. And that was really one of the first times I was I had seen that many rare species extirpated by an invasive species. Then in 2017 in Northwest Creek, I got a report. There's a sea level fen there with 12 rare species, and that had been taken over by Phragmites too, and they couldn't find any of the rare species at that time. So Phragmites is really becoming a big problem in the salt marshes down on Long Island, and you can see ever since the mid-90s, it's really been a problem. Staying on Long Island, another interesting place are the coastal plain ponds, and these are glacial ponds, glacial kettle ponds, and they're shorelines which have the most rare species of any natural community in New York. And here you can see there's 5 general areas for them. There's 58 state endangered, threatened, and rare species that have been found on those coastal plain ponds. Just an amazing array of rare species. 3 of them are globally rare. There's 10 species that are just restricted to those coastal plain ponds in New York. 5 of them are no longer there. But we've been looking at these ponds lately. But back in the 80s, the Nature Conservancy bought some of these ponds and was really instrumental in preserving a lot of areas around the coastal plain ponds. And their concerns were, at that time, lowering of the water table, the pollution of runoff into the ponds, the groundwater, whether it was polluted or not. And all these are still problems. ATVs and trampling are still problems. But back in the 80s, they weren't even thinking about invasive species. And because no one had seen any invasive species, they hadn't been recorded by the Natural Heritage Program. And so it was all native plants. And then in 2017, by 2017 now, 53% of those coastal plain ponds have invasive species in them. And that's the list. Mainly Phragmites is the big problem now, coming into these coastal plain pond shorelines. This is a coastal plain pond that has dried up in drought years. They dry down because they're connected to the groundwater, mostly groundwater ponds. And in wet years, this is full of water, and in dry years, it's like this. And this is a lot of the rare species. Fortunately, there has been some work there. The Quality Parks, which is an organization on Long Island, has been tackling the mile-a-minute vine there. And DEC is starting to work on some of the Phragmites. Another place on Long Island is Hempstead Plains, and we did a big survey of the Hempstead Plains last year, community and rare plant survey. You can see down on the lower left, it's in Nassau County. It used to encompass 60,000 acres, many square miles of Long Island into Suffolk County, but now it's restricted now to this small area along the Meadowbrook Parkway. And it contains 14 rare, threatened, and endangered plant species. 2 are globally rare. This whole community is globally rare. It's only one of a kind. 3 species have the state's best occurrence. So back in 1972, there was a flora done. There were only 8 invasive species listed there. On 1984 list, only 6 invasive species. Then, by the 20-teens, you can see the amount of invasive species that have come into a place like this. A small preserve surrounded by development. And now there's 34 invasive species surrounding it and in it, and 23 that are ranked high or very high. Here's a picture of Lesbinia cuneata that uses a bush clover. Part of the preserve, and this one's really hard to control. So you can see the amount of the increase in invasive species over that amount of time. And I just wanted to illustrate how hard it is now for a lot of these land managers in small preserves like Underhill Preserve here in Nassau County to deal with all these invasive species. Underhill Preserve has 12 rare plants, and on the left are the white names of the rare plants. On the right, this is near Oyster Bay, on the right is the map of the invasive species. So again, you can see a number of rare species there, number of high and very high ranked species. So these land managers are dealing with this, having a really hard time. Succession now and disturbance it doesn't come back all native, it comes back a lot as native and invasive species. They're working in Underhill. DEC is putting goats there. You can see he has a nice necklace of mile-a-minute vine, and they've had some success with controlling the invasives there. But again, it would be nice to have a statewide sort of a template for land managers to use to do these invasive control on these smaller preserves. The pine bush here has a nice management plan. You can see they did one back in 2009 and an update in 2017. The graphics have gotten a lot better too. So I would recommend that be done. Another place where we had invasives come in was Whiteface Mountain. A lot of visitation there, but until recently there were only really 2 small occurrences of a couple of invasives, caraway and wild chervil. This has 14 state rare species, a globally rare species. And then in 2014 and 2015, they reconstructed the road to the top and brought in contaminated fill here in that dirt there along the side of the road, and 13 new weed species were introduced to the highway. So those are now close by the rare species. Fortunately, APIP has been working a lot on trying to control this. Zach has had some people out there. Here's pulling sweet white clover. See how big it gets there. And they're really working hard to protect the rare species. 2 of them, snowline wintergreen, that's the only occurrence in the state for that species, and Boots rattlesnake root is the largest population in New York up on Whiteface. Let's move out to Western New York with Burgeoned Swamp. Is a huge swamp just southwest of Rochester. And in Burgeon, we have 21 state rare plants, 1 globally rare, a goldenrod, Hilton's goldenrod. It's also federally threatened. 5 rare animals, 2 of those are globally rare, and 3 rare communities. So it's a really special place. Looking back at the old plant list in 1930, they had Phragmites on the list. Whether that was the native, there is native Phragmites at Burgeon, so this might have been the native one. 1946, barberry was recorded. Then the 80s and 90s, Phragmites, the exotic Phragmites started to fill up the fens and become a big problem there. 92, buckthorn was recorded. And then just with recent mapping with IMAP in 2014 and 15, you can see all those other species that they have recorded. None of these species are listed on those early lists up into the 80s. And then in 2009, slender false brome found its way into Burgeoned Swamp, and this is one of the biggest problems there. This grass, which covers the forest floor, it's a European grass, and it's sort of a Phragmites of the understory forest floor. They've been working hard on trying to eradicate the invasives there. Western New York has had some people in there showing some of the barberry work, and there's now a false brome working group in the state to try and work on that. So from sites, I'd like to go from that to the federally listed endangered and threatened plant species in New York. And there are 8 of them. There are 3 that are endangered. You can see there in the upper 3 species. And then there are 5 threatened species. All of the species were not threatened by invasives back in the 80s. And there were no invasives surrounding them. Now you can see sandplain agalinus on the coastal plain. It occurs in Hempstead Plains, and another site where there's a lot of invasives there now, which started in the 2000s. Fortunately, small world begonia orchid, northeastern bulrush, and northern monkshood don't have any invasives around them, so that's good. Sea beach amaranth is a picture down below, is a threatened plant on the beaches of Long Island, and that started to become threatened with Asiatic sand sedge in 2013. You can see a monoculture of sand sedge there on the right. Heartsong Fern in the limestone areas of central New York, starting in the early 2000s, started to become threatened, especially with black swallowwort. Houghton's goldenrod talked about in Burgeoned Swamp. And then Levy's roseroot is on the cliffs in Seneca Lake, along the southern part of Seneca Lake. And no invasives until '91 when Japanese knotweed started to turn up along the shore there and black swallowwort on the cliffs. So we're starting to see a lot more invasive species threatening these federally listed species. Here's summer interns from the Parks Department of New York City pulling the sand sedge to try and preserve the CB tamarant there. And you can see the long rhizomes that it has in the sand. So it's pretty difficult to get it out sometimes. New York City Parks has done a great job covering the plants and getting rid of them. And this is in the Rockaways. So there's much less threat now than there used to be. So that's good. Here's a Heartsong Fern with the long strap-like leaves right here. This is at a state park out in central New York, and then this is a black swallowwort here, right next to it. And here are some people from the Forces group out in central New York in one of the state parks controlling the swallowwort. You can see what a monoculture that makes. They're controlling it around some of the Heartsong Fern population. So that's been great work by them to try and preserve this species. And there's been a lot of good work recently on preserving rare plants around the state from invasive species. I just wanted to go back and talk about how this all started in the 90s. Really, in the 80s, we weren't seeing much with invasive species. But beginning in the 90s, we started to see more. And state parks contacted me and Bob Zaremba from the Nature Conservancy, and they were concerned about the increase in invasives. And we got together and had our first meeting about exotic invasives in 1994. And that was over the Parks Department. And then in 1995, we decided to formally call ourselves the Ad Hoc Group for Invasive Plant Management. And that was created in 1995. And I came up with the top 20 list of invasives. That was the first species list back then. So we were starting to get more and more concerned about what invasives were doing in natural areas. And in 1999, the Nature Conservancy funded the creation of the Invasive Plant Council. So that was the next stage. The ad hoc group was kind of absorbed into the Invasive Plant Council. There was a director and staff for that. So more things were happening around the state with invasives. And actually, Meg Wilkinson was the last director of that group. And then in 2007, the Invasive Species Council, the state legislation was approved. And all that work from IPC was transferred to the DEC and the PRISM. So it's just really great now that we have this PRISM network to work on these invasive problems with rare species. And I look forward to working with the PRISM leaders and others to keep this protection going. And I thought I would sort of end here with a slide of one of our more beautiful endangered plants. This is Agellinus tessimloba, the sand plant Agellinus in the grasslands of Long Island. So thank you very much, and I'll take any questions.